No. The answer to the question in the title of the video is no. But it's a lot closer than you'd think. To explain exactly how that's possible, I need to talk about a spell you might have never used a single time in your entire Deltarune playthrough. Pacify. If you're a normal Deltarune player, your knowledge of Pacify probably begins and ends at the spell that lets you get rid of werewires immediately. And you'd generally be right, because the tiredness mechanic only shows up a couple of times in a normal run. However, if you look beneath the surface, you'll find that a bizarre amount of enemies have specific actions and interactions to make them tired, and there's even a dedicated flag in the game's code that tracks how many enemies you've pacified separate from spares. Naturally, that leads to a question. Is it possible to beat Deltarune by exclusively pacifying enemies? No. Most boss fights in the game are scripted to end automatically when you reach a specific condition, and therefore can't be pacified. But what if we say that encounters that end automatically don't count, and make the question, is it possible to beat Deltarune without sparing enemies? Well, yes, and pretty trivially. If you fight enemies until they're at low HP, they automatically become tired and you could pacify them. So therefore, the final question is it possible to beat Deltarune without sparing or fighting enemies? Now, the answer to this is still no. But with this rule set, figuring out the minimum number of spares is actually an interesting challenge. So, to sum up the final rule set, 1. No cheating, glitches, exploits, or other speedrun tactics. Now this is because I am a person of integrity, and not because I don't know how to do any speedrun tactics. 2. No fighting. Chris cannot fight an enemy, nor command a member of their party to fight an enemy. Note, for the sake of this rule, shooting someone with a giant yellow energy blast from your soul does not count as attacking them. 3. No sparing. For the purposes of this run, a spare is any time I select somebody's name in the spare menu. 4. Recruits. When we get to Chapter 2, I am obligated to get every recruit possible. This does sometimes conflict with getting the minimum spares, and I'll address that problem when we get to it. And finally, 5. Whenever possible, pacify enemies. To keep this video interesting, I'll be keeping a scoreboard. Every unique enemy I pacify will be 1 point, and every individual enemy I'm forced to spare will be a negative point. Encounters that end automatically will be neutral encounters and won't count for or against me, but I'll keep track of them anyway. Okay, that is all the clarification and preamble needed for this run. Let's start. To begin the run, we give our vessel some fitting choices, and in a very thematically relevant move, go to sleep to skip the Light World segments. Speedrun to Castletown, and Lancer. Lancer is one of those neutral encounters I was talking about earlier. His fight ends regardless of what you do after a certain amount of turns, so we're off to a very whelming start. Now, there are a couple of ways to end the dummy fight without fighting or sparing, but the easiest way is to just skip the entire fight, so that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to keep Ralsei's manual here. It technically has an ability where if you use it in battle, it makes Rudens tired, but that doesn't actually end up being that helpful. Really, I'm just keeping it because I'm not some kind of heartless monster. Oh, speaking of Ruden, we have our first actual encounter, and it goes really well. In fact, Rudens are going to be our best friend for pretty much the entirety of the field, since they appear in nearly every enemy encounter and have the lecture act that makes them tired. 1 point for us. To show just how useful Rudens are, we have our next enemy, Hathy. Now, Hathies have no acts that make them tired, which would ordinarily make them impossible to pacify. However, one of the major benefits of acts that make enemies tired is that they make all the enemies tired. Hathies are a support enemy, which means they're only ever encountered with other enemies, and never by themselves, since that would be stupid. So, all we have to do is lecture an accompanying Ruden, and Hathy will get tired too. So that basically covers the field encounters. All we have to do is grab the cake, walk through some mazes, fight Lancers, Hathies, and...
Hathies have no acts that make them tired. Possible to pacify me ever encountered with other enemies, and never by themselves.
Well, turns out there is a fight in the game where you encounter just Hathies, and it happens to be scripted and unskippable. There's no rudens to lecture, and not even the manual does anything here, so I'm pretty sure this is the first mandatory spare of the run. That's a pretty bad start, but I promise you the run does get better from here. Thoroughly humbled by 3 glasses of milk, we grab Susie and do the C-round fight, which ends on its own no matter what you do. We get taunted by Ralsei with our inability to just beat people up until they pass out, spend all our money at Shams before talking to the tutorial guy to scam him into giving us free tutorials, and then move on to our second major challenge, Jigsawry. Although comically easy to spare, Jigsawries have no way to make them tired, which means that for a second time this chapter, Lancer has bested us. There is nothing we can do in this situation, we just have to accept our loss. Oh. Okay, now I know this looks like cheating, but if we decided that this doesn't count as a spare because I'm not pressing the spare button, then this shouldn't count as an attack because I have no input over what Susie does. She just decides to do that on her own. But yes, I understand that this is definitely a loophole, and I did deliberate over whether or not to allow this, but if you look ahead to the rest of the chapter, this auto-fighting mechanic is literally never useful beyond this battle, so I really don't think it's unreasonable to allow it in specifically this circumstance. After the Jigsawries, there are a couple more Ruden and Hathi encounters that we already covered, and Pawn Men, who you literally can't spare without making tired. Make sure to skip the key piece right now for reasons I will explain later. Name ourselves the Lancer Fan Club because it's the obvious choice, and get to the K-Round boss fight. Like every other boss, K-Round ends the fight as soon as you knock the crown off, at which point Susie immediately leaves the party, which is what I was talking about when I said the auto-attacking feature is really not useful in this run. Alright, Scarlet Forest time. Now, the first new enemy here is Rabbik, which is a bit of an interesting case. All of the Rabbiks in this chapter are actually able to be dodged if you know their movement pattern, but if you do get into a fight with a Rabbik, it actually isn't that big of a deal. Rarely among non-boss enemies, if you use the Breathe Act on a Rabbik twice, it will blow away and end the fight peacefully without having to press the spare button. Yes, this counts as ending the fight peacefully, even though this Rabbik is definitely dead. Go through this area normally, grab the Ragger just for completion's sake, solve a puzzle, and juke this Bloxer, because we don't really have a way to deal with him right now. Grab the Dice Brace and make our way over to Clover's room. Now, I was initially scared of the Clover encounter, since she's technically a mini-boss and therefore doesn't end the fight automatically when you reach 100% mercy. However, unbeknownst to me, Clover is actually pacifiable. All you have to do is fail the conversation over and over and she'll eventually just get tired. Okay, once we're at the bake sale, repair the broken cake, grab a Lancer cookie, and get prepared for the most bullshit part of the run. I'm going to let my field expert explain how this one works. Okay, let's kind of set this out scientifically here. So you see these 2 Bloxers here, right? We have to dodge past them up and around, once here and then twice here, because we can't pacify them or really deal with them in any way right now. So you might be thinking, if you've played Deltarune before, oh, this is actually really easy because they have this movement pattern where they go back and forth along this line, and their vision cone looks something like this. You know, they basically can only see this line and they have a big blind spot behind them. So if we just run up, Well, this one's turning around, and before this one shows up, we can dodge them pretty easily. Now, that is how it works if you're playing the game like a normal human being. But there's a feature in Deltarune, Chapter 1 specifically, where if you haven't encountered an enemy before, their vision cone, instead of looking like this, it looks something a little more, I would say, along the lines of this, where they can see you across the entire goddamn map, and then they run at Mach 7 directly towards you and immediately encounter you. So, needless to say, this is a little bit more difficult in this run than it would be normally. Alright, back to the studio. After getting past these Bloxers, by grace of God, there luckily aren't any other mandatory encounters, and the rest of the dodging is pretty easy for the rest of the forest. So, continue through the area, get the second key piece, build a duck, talk to the original Starwalker, somehow get the egg in like 5 tries. Forget that the egg sets you back to before the Bloxers and do the entire thing over again. Complete a puzzle and get to the maze. Now we just have to dodge all the encounters in the maze, which is pretty simple because... oh god... Okay, finally make our way to the end of the maze and get to the Lancer and Susie fight. Now, this fight is a neutral encounter, but if you attempt to pacify Susie while she's asleep, Lancer will block the pacify attempt with his bike. And if you do this 3 times, you successfully spare Lancer's tire, which should definitely count, right? Flawlessly dodge every bullet from the Rune Rangers, get beat up anyway, and end up in the dungeon. Eat some moss, grab a shackle, and get involuntarily thrust into Susie's POV. Okay, yes, the versus Susie fight is a glorified cutscene, but it technically counts as an encounter, so I'm gonna count it. Luckily, we already established it's not against the rules for Susie to attack someone without our input, so it's just a neutral encounter. Ride an elevator, and finally get Susie as part of our party for real. Now that we have Susie, just to address this, yes, damage-dealing magic does not involve opening the fight menu. No, it's not allowed. Rude Buster, Red Buster, Ice Shock, and I guess technically Snowgrave are all not allowed for this run. Now that we're free, we could just go straight to the King fight and complete the chapter with the lowest amount of spares possible. But there are still Darkners to pacify, including one very wacky guy in the basement. So, have a chat with Jevil and start heading back to Sham. On our way, we encounter Ruden Ranger, who can be pacified just as easily as Ruden using the Convince Act. Now, head back to Sham, pick up our first key piece and some healing items, then head back to the bake sale. Remember earlier when I said we couldn't deal with Bloxers right now? Well, for some reason, Bloxers have an act that is specific to having Susie in your party that can make them tired, despite being encountered nowhere near where the average player would actually have Susie in their party. Also, for some reason, when you use this act, Susie is the one who says the enemies became tired, even though in every other encounter that's just flavor text. That feels like a bug, but it's just in character enough to maybe be intentional. I don't know. Anyways, bug or not, Susie is in fact telling the truth about Boxer being tired, so we can finally take our revenge and get the 40 bucks from the secret chest. Now, once we get the spin cake from the Top Chef, we are finally ready to get the last key piece. Now, why did I say we need to specifically wait to get this key piece instead of getting it on our first pass through the field like most people do on their repeat playthroughs? Well, it's simple. Jigsawry. If you recall from earlier when we talked about Jigsaws, there is no specific act that makes them tired. However, there is one encounter where they show up naturally alongside a Rudin, and using the lecture act on the Rudin, we can then pacify the Jigsawry. However, this encounter, Smorgasbord, only exists in this one room in the entire game, and it only appears if you backtrack from Card Castle. I'm somewhat of a regular Deltarune aficionado, so I always make a habit of getting the key piece on the first pass. As a result, I may or may not have spent, let's say, a couple of weeks going through every encounter in the field trying specifically to find this one until I saw a random Tumblr post that told me where it was. Anyways, with that over with, now we're finally ready to actually take on Card Castle. There isn't too much to talk about in the castle, except for one very notable thing. Remember that whole discussion we had about the Bloxers in the forest and the buffed vision cones? Well, this is Head Hathy. The intended way to get past Head Hathy is shoving yourself in this tiny crevice. And unfortunately, the buffed vision cone can see directly into it. So this counter is unavoidable. This wouldn't be a problem if there was a way to pacify Head Hathys, but there isn't. Luckily, we can make 2 of them leave out of awkwardness, but the third one is an unavoidable spare. At least we can pick up the Bed Inspector rank as a consolation prize. Once we reach the top of Card Castle, we can stock up on some shiny new equipment and head down to the Jevil fight. I could make this a really dramatic montage, but let's be real. It's Jevil. You've seen Jevil before. I beat him first try. It's whatever. Interestingly enough, Jevil is literally the only boss in the game whose fight doesn't immediately end when you reach the spare condition, and he happens to only be spareable via Pacify. Which technically makes the Jevil fight mandatory for this run if you want to do it. With our fancy new Jevil's tail, we're ready to go and face the Chaos King, our toughest challenge yet. Here's a compilation of all the times I got hit during the King fight. With King defeated, we finally reached the halfway point of this run, sadly ending with a neutral encounter. Now, if you beat enemies via violence throughout Chapter 1, you actually get a bad ending where King does get pacified, but unfortunately the rules of this challenge don't allow us to use violence, so... Oh. Oh. Wait, I remember that. Well, that's convenient. Also, I'm absolutely counting this. I know it's a cutscene, but the Pacify spell gets cast on him, and that's how the fight ends, so it counts. Alright, time to check in with the scoreboard. In Chapter 1, we can pacify 9 unique enemies, with the only unpacifiable regular enemies being Rabbik and Head Hathy. We had 7 encounters that ended on their own without any sparing or pacifying on our part, and 4 enemies over 2 encounters that we were forced to spare, meaning we actually have a significant lead with pacified encounters. There isn't any recruiting in this chapter, so we don't have to worry about that, and we were able to complete the secret boss and get every piece of equipment and item. Overall verdict, you can basically beat all of Deltarune Chapter 1 without sparing or fighting. However, Chapter 1 was just a warm-up. It's time for the real challenge.